Konnichiwa, minasan. O genki desu ka? Welcome to the intermediate course of my channel. Let's learn Japanese with Eric. In this lesson, we'll learn how to say must in Japanese. Yoroshii desu ka? Hajimemashou. In this lesson, we learn how to make sentences such as I must wake up at 7 a.m. tomorrow. The house has to be clean before guests arrive. Or, the next car I buy must be a Mercedes. These are sentences of social obligation and use the must conjugation in Japanese. It's synonymous with have to, need to, or should be. The must conjugation derives from the nai form, from which you make conditionals. And there are at least 10 ways to express the must conjugation. The must conjugation can be expressed using verbs, adjectives, nouns, and pronouns. At this point, I assume you know how to make the nai form of verbs. It's a basic conjugation, but if you need to review how to make them, you can watch lessons 26 to 30. You also need to know how to conjugate adjectives into their nai forms, and you can review how to do this in lessons 15 and 16. For pronouns and nouns, we will be conjugating the verb to be, or da. I also assume you already know how to construct Japanese sentences using particles, which you can review in lessons 22 to 24. The must conjugation is a bit complicated to make in Japanese because it's indirectly said. In English, we just have one word, must, and that's it. But in Japanese, it has two parts. The first part says, if you don't do, which is a negative conditional. And the second part spells out a negative consequence. Then it won't work. If you don't do, then it won't work. Therefore, you must. The first part uses two conditionals, Nakereba and naito. The third is a negative te form, nakutewa. These three all derive from the nai form. Then for the second part, you have four choices. Narimasen, which means won't become. Ikemasen, which means cannot go. Dame desu, which means it's no good. And komarimasu, which means I'll be troubled. You can review how to make the Nakereba conditional in lesson 62D and the naito conditional in lesson 62B. Now, what's the difference between these three? They more or less mean the same thing and can be used very interchangeably. However, the Nakereba conjugation is mostly used for things that the speaker ought to do, personal obligation, while the other two, naito and nakutewa, are used for what other people ought to do. Nakereba is also found in legal documents like the law, what people should do, no exemptions. Nakereba shortens to nakya and nakutewa to nakcha in fast informal speech. And here are the four for part 2. Plain form of ikemasen is ikenai. That of narimasen is naranai. Dame desu is dame. And komarimasu is komaru. That's the dictionary form. Naito can pair with either of these four, and so with nakereba and nakya, as well as nakutewa and nakcha. So right there, that gives you 20 possibilities of how you can express must in Japanese. However, the usual partners are naito ikemasen, nakereba narimasen, and nakutewa ikemasen. So just to give you a visual of how everything emanates from the nai form, from nai we form naito, nakereba, and nakutewa. Nakereba can shorten to nakya or nakeria, and nakutewa to nakcha in fast informal speech. So just to illustrate how many different ways we can say must eat, let's start off with the verb taberu, to eat. Its negative is tabenai. Focus on the nai part because that's where everything changes to these three for part 1. So to say must eat, I can say tabenai to ikemasen, 食べないとなりません。食べないとダメです。食べないと困ります。I can also say 食べなければいけません。食べなければなりません。食べなければダメです。食べなければ困ります。And last set 食べなくてはいけません。食べなくてはなりません。食べなくてはダメです。食べなくては困ります。Then of course the plain forms and using nakya and nakcha. Now, when the context of a conversation is clear, part 2 can be omitted and just say, for example, 食べなきゃ or 食べなくちゃ, and you'll be understood it is a must conjugation. Our first example is conjugating a verb. Say the sentence, I have to do it. Here are some ways to say I have to do it. The verb to do is suru. Negative is shinai. So I can say, しなければなりません。しなければなりません。しないといけません。しないといけません。しなければいけません。しなければいけません。しなくてはなりません。しなくてはなりません。しなくてはいけません。しなくてはいけません。しないとダメです。しないとダメです。しなければ困ります。しなければ困ります。And they all mean the same thing. I have to do it. Next example is still a verb. You must close the door. The verb to close is shimeru, and its nai form is shimenai. So I can say, ドアを閉めないといけません。ドアを閉めないといけません。ドアを閉めなければなりません。ドアを閉めなければなりません。ドアを閉めなければいけません。ドアを閉めなければいけません。ドアを閉めなくてはなりません。ドアを閉めなくてはなりません。ドアを閉めなくてはいけません。ドアを閉めなくてはいけません。ドアを閉めないとダメです。ドアを閉めないとダメです。ドアを閉めなければ困ります。ドアを閉めなければ困ります。Next example is still a verb and the sentence, you must rest tomorrow. To rest is yasumu, and its nai form is yasumanai. Let's use plain forms this time. So I can say, 明日、君は休まないといけない。明日、君は休まないといけない。明日、君は休まなければならない。明日、君は休まなければならない。明日、君は休まなければいけない。明日、君は休まなければいけない。明日、君は休まなくてはならない。明日、君は休まなくてはならない。明日、君は休まなくてはいけない。明日、君は休まなくてはいけない。明日、君は休まないと困る。明日、君は休まないと困る。明日、君は休まなければダメ。明日、君は休まなければダメ。In our next example, we'll be conjugating an E adjective, and we'll use plain forms and shortcuts in our sample sentences. For example, the sentence, flowers must be red. Maybe it's the overall look of the wedding party. Red is an E adjective, akai. Its nai form is akakunai. So to say, flowers must be red, I can say, hana wa akakunai to ikenai. Hana wa akakunai to ikenai. Hana wa akaku nakereba naranai. Hana wa akaku nakereba naranai. Hana wa akaku nakeria. Hana wa akaku nakeria. Hana wa akaku nakcha naranai. Hana wa akaku nakcha naranai. Hana wa akaku nakcha. Hana wa akaku nakcha. Hana wa akaku nai to dame. Hana wa akaku nai to dame. Hana wa akaku nakereba komaru. Hana wa akaku nakereba komaru. For non-adjectives, they're grammatically nouns, and so we lump them together with pronouns and nouns. For these, we conjugate the verb to be, or da, and the nai form of da is dewanai, or to contract dewa, janai. And when conjugated for must, we often see just denai. These are our starting points. For examples in this lesson, I'll use just janai. Next example is a na-adjective, and the sentence, nurses must be kind. So if you're not a kind person, you shouldn't go into nursing. Now kind is shinsetsu na, and its nai form is shinsetsu janai. And just changing the nai part, I can say, kangofu wa shinsetsu janai to ikenai. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janai to ikenai. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janakereba naranai. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janakereba naranai. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janakeria. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janakeria. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janakucha naranai. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janakucha naranai. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janakucha. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janakucha. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janai to dame. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janai to dame. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janakereba komaru. Kangofu wa shinsetsu janakereba komaru. Our next example is that of a pronoun, watashi, and the sentence is, the one who will go must be me. The nai form of watashi is watashi janai, and I can say, iku no ga watashi janai to ikenai. Iku no ga watashi janai to ikenai. Iku no ga watashi janakereba naranai. Iku no ga watashi janakereba naranai. Iku no ga watashi janakereba ikenai. Iku no ga watashi janakereba ikenai. Iku no ga watashi janakucha naranai. Iku no ga watashi janakucha naranai. Iku no ga watashi janakucha ikenai. Iku no ga watashi janakucha ikenai. Iku no ga watashi janai to dame. Iku no ga watashi janai to dame. Iku no ga watashi janakereba komaru. Iku no ga watashi janakereba komaru. Our last comprehensive example is that of a noun. The sentence is, the blood must be type O. Say someone needs a blood transfusion, and we specifically need type O blood. Type O is O-gata in Japanese, and the nai form is O-gata janai. So we can say, using all formal forms, ketsueki wa O-gata janai to ikemasen. Ketsueki wa O-gata janai to ikemasen. Ketsueki wa O-gata janakereba narimasen. Ketsueki wa O-gata janakereba narimasen. Ketsueki wa O-gata janakereba ikemasen. Ketsueki wa O-gata janakereba ikemasen. Ketsueki wa O-gata janakucha narimasen. Ketsueki wa O-gata janakucha narimasen. Ketsueki wa O-gata janakucha ikemasen. Ketsueki wa O-gata janakucha ikemasen. Ketsueki wa O-gata janai to dame desu. Ketsueki wa O-gata janai to dame desu. And ketsueki wa O-gata janakereba komarimasu. Ketsueki wa O-gata janakereba komarimasu. So, do you get the gist of it all? It's not as confusing as it sounds. You just have a lot of choices. Now I'll say some sentences in Japanese and try to translate them in English. First one. Onaka ga suita. Tabenakereba naranai. Onaka ga suita. Tabenakereba naranai. In English, I'm hungry. I need to eat. Neru mae ni ha wo miganakereba ikemasen. Neru mae ni ha wo miganakereba ikemasen. In English, before I sleep, I must brush my teeth. Or before you sleep, you must brush your teeth. The neru mae ni conjugation indicates before doing so-and-so. And you can review this conjugation in lesson 35. Tabete kara 皿を洗わないといけません。食べてから皿を洗わないといけません。Translation: You must wash the plates after eating, or I must wash the plates after eating. The tekara conjugation indicates after doing so-and-so, and you can review this in lesson 36. 冬に使うジャケットだから暖かくなくてはならない。冬に使うジャケットだから暖かくなくてはならない。Now that was like a tongue twister. In English, because it's a jacket I'll use in winter, it must be warm. At the beginning of the sentence, we have a verb clause, 冬に使う, or I will use in winter. And we nominalize that whole verb clause with a noun, jacket. 冬に使うジャケット, a jacket I'll use in winter. You can review making noun-based subordinate clauses in lesson 43. お金があまりないから買う車は安くないとダメ。お金があまりないから買う車は安くないとダメ。And in English, because I don't have much money, the car I buy must be cheap. 校長先生は人間関係が上手じゃなければいけません。校長先生は人間関係が上手じゃなければいけません。Translation: A school principal must be good at human relations. Absolutely, because they have to deal with students, faculty, and parents. 上手な is a na adjective expressing what one is good at. You can learn all about expressing simple ability in lesson 8. 寝室は静かでなければ困ります。寝室は静かでなければ困ります。Translation: The bedroom must be quiet. Yeah, because nobody wants a noisy bedroom. 申込書をサインするのが私じゃないとダメです。申込書をサインするのが私じゃないとダメです。Translation: The one who signs the application form must be me. We have the particle no turning the whole verb clause 申込書をサインする into a noun clause. We use no for emphasis. You can review nominalization using no and koto in lesson 44. 映画は日本で上映しますので、字幕スーパーが日本語でなければなりません。映画は日本で上映しますので、字幕スーパーが日本語でなければなりません。In English, because the movie will screen in Japan, the subtitles must be in Japanese. So what's the opposite of must? It is must not. For example, when we say you must eat, the opposite of that is you must not eat, which is a prohibition, a conjugation we learned to make in lesson 38. So to say you must eat, we can say among the so many options, あなたは食べないといけません。あなたは食べないといけません。And to say you must not eat in Japanese would be あなたは食べてはいけません。あなたは食べてはいけません。To summarize, in this lesson, we learned how to express must in Japanese. The conjugation expresses social obligation and is synonymous with, in English, have to, need to, ought to, or should. The conjugation is expressed very indirectly in Japanese and is very long, using two parts. The first part is a negative conditional, if you don't do, and the second part expresses a negative result. If you don't do, then negative result. Therefore, you must. The first part uses any of these three. Nakereba, which shortens to nakya, naito, and nakutewa, which shortens to nakcha. And the second part uses any of these four: narimasen, ikemasen, dame desu, and komarimasu. And of course, their plain forms: naranai, ikenai, dameda, and komaru. And when you pair them up, you have these many combinations. So there are at least 10 or even 20 ways to say must. The must conjugation can be used for verbs, adjectives, pronouns, and nouns. Now, despite the many combinations possible, the most commonly used are Nakereba narimasen, which is mostly used for the speaker's personal and social obligations. Then we have naito ikemasen and nakutewa ikemasen, which are used to give commands to others. You must do this. But they can also be used for the speaker's obligations. The opposite of must is must not, which is the prohibition conjugation that we learned in lesson 38, tewa ikemasen. And this ends our lesson on the must conjugation. Tsugi no lesson ni mata aimashou. If you're serious about becoming fluent in Japanese, it's important to practice daily, learn grammar, and build up vocabulary. My whole course is designed to give you a strong basic foundation in the Japanese language that you can build solidly upon. So please click like, share, or subscribe and watch the next video in the series. Nihongo no benkyou ni ganbatte kudasai. じゃあ、またね。